The discovery of the rich goldfields of the Witwatersrand in March 1886 brought not only unknown wealth to the South African Republic, but also an influx of foreigners. It was this influx of foreigners that led to the so-called Uitlander problem, when they demanded and the Kruger government refused to grant them the vote. Uitlander disenchantment with the Kruger government, the imperialistic ideals of Rhodes, and the greed for the riches of gold eventually led to the Jameson Raid. This raid was plotted by Rhodes and his great friend, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, who was waiting in his camp in Pitsani for orders to start the invasion. Then, on the 29th of December, 1895, he decided, despite information that the time was not right to proceed, that he'd lick the burghers all around the Transvaal. The hoped-for uprising of the Uitlanders did not materialize, and Jameson and his troops were forced to surrender on the 2nd of January 1896, and Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Kruger, on the other hand, had profited greatly from the Jameson Raid. He united the support of the folk behind him. Alfred Milner was appointed Governor of the Cape Province and High Commissioner for South Africa in 1897. He was determined to break Kruger's power and assure Britain's political control of the Transvaal, and he was prepared to go to war to achieve this. Before he could proceed with his plans for intervention, the Bloemfontein Conference was organized by Kruger's allies to try to get a peaceful solution to the crisis. The Bloemfontein Conference broke down. Military reinforcements were sent to South Africa, and Chamberlain drafted an ultimatum, but delayed it so as to land more troops in South Africa. By this time, President Kruger of the South African Republic and President Steyn of the Orange Free State were convinced that Britain was determined to destroy the independence of the South African Republic. Kruger decided to strike before the reinforcements arrived and issued his own ultimatum that expired at 5 p.m. on the 11th of October, 1899, demanding the withdrawal of British troops from the South African Republic's borders. This ultimatum was not answered. The war was on. Britain went to war to establish British supremacy throughout South Africa. The republics went to war to preserve their independence. It was to be a most terrible war and would change the face of South Africa for all its inhabitants. The army was still very much a textbook or parade ground army. They lacked experience to fight effectively in South African conditions. They were disciplined and very much bound by a reliance on authority and the chain of command. They were not dressed in their traditional and highly visible red coats for this war, but in khaki to make them less visible to the Boer sharpshooters. The British were armed with the Lee Metford and the slightly different Lee Enfield rifles, which had a box-like magazine that held 10 bullets. Due to the lack of field artillery, the British dismounted guns from some of their ships in Cape Town and Durban. They mounted these guns on improvised carriages hauled by oxen, and they became known as cow guns. They were poorly equipped as far as maps and battle plans were concerned. Some army officers had to use school atlases to guide them over unfamiliar territory. The commander-in-chief of the British Army at the onset of the war was General Redvers Buller. The Boers were not professional soldiers. They were more independent than the British, and they elected their own generals. It was not a problem to retreat from a difficult battle situation and to continue the fight later under more favorable circumstances. At the time of the Jameson Raid, as many as 40% of the Boers called up for military service did not own a firearm. General Joubert purchased 20,000 single-shot Martini Henry rifles and later equipped the Boers with Mauser magazine rifles. The Boers also armed themselves with effective artillery, the 4 Schneider siege guns, nicknamed Long Toms, were able to shoot a 43-kilogram shell over a range of up to 10 kilometers. The Boer commander-in-chief at the beginning of the war was General Piet Joubert. The British had a considerable advantage as far as numbers were concerned, and so it was up to the Boer forces to take the initiative of the war to the British before too many soldiers arrived in South Africa from Britain and the Empire. They also did not have maps, but they had the advantage of knowing the territory well. The fighting strategy that they favored as most effective and least wasteful of men and energy was to lay siege to the enemy and wait for him to surrender. This strategy worked against the African chiefdoms, but it was ineffective against an empire that could ship limitless reinforcements from all parts of the world. The war can be divided into 3 phases. The first phase of the war started when the Boers invaded the British territories of Bechuanaland, the Cape and Natal, and laid siege to the towns of Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith. In October 1899, the British troops in South Africa were about the same number as the Boers. Their task at that stage was to stop the Boers advancing into the Cape and Natal until reinforcements arrived from Britain and the colonies. The first battle of the war was fought just a few days after the Boer invasion of Natal. Joubert's army had occupied Newcastle with hardly any resistance from the 2 British armies in Natal. The main British force of 16,000 men was under command of Lieutenant General Sir George White, who arrived 2 weeks earlier as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in Natal. A smaller force of 4,000 men under Major General Sir William Penn Simmons was stationed in Dundee. The Boer commandos from Utrecht and Vryheid under General Lucas Meyer formed the left flank of Joubert's army. It was between these commandos and the garrison in Dundee that the first battle of the war was fought, at Talana Hill just outside the town. Penn Simmons was fatally wounded by rifle fire in this first battle. Although the British won this battle, they decided to withdraw. The man who later became famous for his passive resistance, Mohandas Gandhi, was the leader of a corps of Indian stretcher-bearers for the British in this war. Dundee was now surrounded by Boer forces, and the garrison was ordered by White to withdraw. On the rainy night of the 23rd of October, the garrison limped from Dundee, leaving behind their dying commander and mounds of supplies. With Dundee taken, Joubert next turned his attention to Ladysmith. The British army was defeated by Joubert's commander at Modderspruit, losing 1,764 men, 1,284 of who surrendered. As the survivors fled back to Ladysmith, Joubert refused to pursue them and settle the war, and at the same time forcing an honourable peace. Joubert stayed put despite the fact that 4/5 of the Natal army was virtually locked up in Ladysmith and the road to Durban was open. The war at this stage became a war of sieges. Ladysmith and Mafeking, as well as Kimberley, came under siege. One of the attractions of taking Kimberley was that Cecil Rhodes, the arch-imperialist and arch-enemy of the Boers, arrived there a short while earlier. Many Cape Boers joined the commandos, but nothing like the hoped-for uprising amongst the Boer sympathizers occurred. The new British Commander-in-Chief, General Redvers Buller, learnt of the dire situation in Natal and the Northern Cape and decided to split his force. He sent General Methuen to relieve Kimberley. His force of 9,000 men advanced towards Kimberley on the 21st of November. They fought battles at Belmont, Graspan, and Modder River, moving steadily northwards towards Kimberley. At Modder River, General de la Rey selected a position from which they dealt a cruel blow to the British. De la Rey also selected the Boers' next position at Margesfontein. While Methuen rested his men at the Modder River, the Boers under General Piet Cronje dug themselves in at the foot of the hills and built low stone parapets facing south across flat, bare plains. Methuen decided on a frontal attack on Margesfontein and selected the Highland Brigade for the task. On the morning of the 11th of December, just after midnight, Major General Andrew Wauchope led his men to the hill of Margesfontein. They passed through dense thorn bush, and at about 4 a.m. the brigade began to change formation when a totally unexpected volley of rifle fire cut into them. Many died in subsequent volleys, and during the day, as they lay in the hot sun, the slightest movement immediately drew accurate fire. The next day, there was a truce to allow the dead and wounded to be brought in. Methuen retreated to his base at Modder River, rather than renew the attack. A day before Methuen's defeat, the British suffered another disaster at Stormberg, near Multino. General Gattager, through a communication slip-up, ended up with a 3,000-strong force, 5 kilometers away from his target. Instead of surprising the Boers at Stormberg, they were themselves surprised in a dawn attack by Orange Free State Boers and rebel sympathizers, commanded by J.H. Ulefied. The venture, including the killed, wounded, and captured, cost Gattager a third of his force, and he achieved nothing. When Buller sent Methuen to the Northern Cape, he went with the other half of the army to Natal, where he had served in the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. When Buller launched 18,000 troops in a frontal attack on the 15th of December across the Tugela at Colenso in a bid to relieve Ladysmith, disaster struck again for the British. This string of disasters became known as Black Week. The Boers under Louis Botha were 6,000 strong and had established themselves in well-fortified positions which the British reconnaissance had failed to reveal fully. After a series of disasters that cost the British 10 guns, Buller gave the order to withdraw. He telegraphed White in Ladysmith to fire as much of his ammunition as possible and then to make the best terms he could with the Boers. By December 1899, the war had virtually reached a stalemate. With the appearance of Field Marshal Lord Roberts on the scene, the second phase of the war started. Among those killed at Colenso was Freddie Roberts, only son of Lord Roberts. The very next day, the 16th of December, Lord Roberts offered his services to the War Office in London, and less than a week later he was on his way to South Africa as the new Commander-in-Chief of the British forces. As his Chief of Staff was appointed Horatio Kitchener. When Roberts arrived in Cape Town on the 10th of January, the stalemate on all fronts remained. The Boers did not take advantage of the strong position they were in. They were still hoping the British would have a change of heart or of government. That was the last thing the British had in mind. They were badly hurt by the losses of Black Week and were more determined than ever to win the war. Volunteer forces were raised in the colonies of Australia, New Zealand and Canada to fight along those of the mother country. The three besieged towns of Kimberley, Ladysmith and Mafeking became a symbol of British prestige. It was unthinkable that one of them should fall. On the day of Roberts' arrival in Cape Town, Buller decided to make another attempt at the relief of Ladysmith. He crossed the Tugela some 30 kilometers west of Colenso with 23,000 men. Then Buller decided to occupy Spionkop. On the night of the 23rd of January, 1,900 men under command of General Edward Woodgate climbed to the summit of Spionkop. Woodgate was killed and his troops torn to pieces by artillery and rifle fire from two nearby hills. Winston Churchill was present during this battle after his daring escape from a Pretoria jail. He went up Spionkop against orders, and the grimness of what he saw shocked him. He reported the situation to Warren, and then took a message up the hill to Thornycroft, who took command, to reassure him that help was on the way. But he and his troops had had enough. They fled under cover of darkness and kept on going over the Tugela. Buller tried again at Valkrans on the 7th of February and again failed. Then finally, on the 28th of February, the news came from Natal. Buller had at long last broken the siege of Ladysmith. Roberts and Kitchener successfully moved 60,000 men in secrecy to the vicinity of Ramdam in the Orange Free State. From there, the cavalry division under command of Sir John French broke through the Boer siege lines and arrived in Kimberley on the 15th of February. The Boers promptly withdrew in the direction of Bloemfontein, but the wagons delayed their retreat. The cavalry set out in pursuit and captured 4,000 burghers under Cronje at Paardeberg Drift on the Modder River. Cronje ignored pleas from the Orange Free State commander, Christian de Wet, to break out, and surrendered on the 27th of February. The main British army entered Bloemfontein on the 13th of March, forcing President Steyn to move his government to Kroonstad, where he and Kruger met for a council of war on the 17th of March and decided to continue the war on a more informal scale, with highly mobile units raiding the British lines of communication. This can be regarded as official approval of the guerrilla tactics that had already been used with considerable success by de Wet. This new approach would completely change the nature of the war, and the hope for freedom from British domination would be high for 2 more years. Shortly after this, Joubert died, and he was replaced as Commandant General by the 38-year-old Louis Botha. Roberts led the main British force along the main rail route to Johannesburg and Pretoria. Buller, with 45,000 troops, was ordered to move north from Natal to meet Roberts. The eyes of the empire now turned to the siege of Mafeking, and when the relieving force rode into Mafeking, the empire rejoiced. 8 days later, on Queen Victoria's birthday, the Orange Free State was annexed to the Crown as the Orange River Colony. President Steyn and his outlawed government took to the veldt, becoming a government on the run, with De Wet and his guerrilla forces. On the 31st of May, 2 days before Roberts entered Johannesburg, Kruger left Pretoria to set up government in Machadodorp. Pretoria was abandoned to the British, and on the 1st of September 1900, the South African Republic became the British colony of Transvaal. Roberts was convinced that the war was over and went home to a hero's welcome and a handsome purse of gold from a grateful parliament. The first Boer priority now was to stop the British consolidating their hold on the South African Republic, and Britte, as Commandant General, was now for all practical purposes ruler of the Republic. He tried unsuccessfully to hold the British advances with his remaining forces just east of Pretoria. Then, in the last set battle of the war, at the end of August 1900, he tried again, near Belfast, in a vicious 6-day battle at Bergendal, and once again was forced to fall back. Finally, Kruger, at 75, too old and sickly to stay on the run with his commandos, left for Europe via Dalgoa Bay to seek aid from the European countries for the Boers. To prevent the Boer prisoners of war from escaping and rejoining the commandos, they were sent to prison camps in St. Helena and Ceylon and were only allowed to return after the war. At this point, we enter the third stage of the South African War. Kitchener was now in command of the British Army. The formal war was over. The guerrilla war was just beginning. And this was the longest part of the war. It was no longer a professional soldiers' war. It was a war of raids on supply dumps, of attacks on troop columns. In guerrilla warfare, commandos fight when it favors them and run when it does not. They strike in the dark when the enemy has no chance of defending himself. It requires a high degree of mobility to attack like lightning and escape without a trace. The guerrillas also executed long-range strikes into the Cape Colony, where they were received with great enthusiasm. Then, under the government of Sir John Sprigg, Parliament passed a bill making collaboration a treasonable offence. Martial law was declared throughout the Cape, and Parliament did not meet again for 2 years until the war was over. The British Army was dependent on the railway system for its continued supply, but Boer sabotage of the railway seriously threatened operations. As counter-threat, Roberts issued proclamations in June 1900 that the houses nearest to any break in the railway would be burnt, the inhabitants imprisoned, and their property destroyed or confiscated. It was expected that the people rendered homeless would attach themselves to a commando and so impair its mobility. The first refugee camps were established in September 1900 for the families of those burghers who had surrendered voluntarily to protect them from those still in the field. Soon there were protests even in England, against the practice of turning women and children adrift on the veldt, so they were concentrated at points close to the railway line and sources of water. From this development, the name concentration camp was derived. Boers were not the only inhabitants of the concentration camp. The African Bewoners, who paid their rent in labor, were also interned. At the end of the war, there were some 115,000 Africans in 66 concentration camps and 136,000 Boers in 50 concentration camps. The camps claimed the lives of more than 26,000 Boers, while more than 14,000 African deaths were recorded on lists known to be incomplete. Africans at the camp in Heidelberg in the South African Republic kept themselves alive by eating the carcasses of cattle that died of disease. At least one person died each day in that camp. The British claimed that the Africans were put in camps for their protection against the Boers, but one of the main reasons was that they wanted to prevent the Africans from fighting on the side of the Boers. The worst month for fatalities was December 1901, when the death rate for Africans rose to 436 per thousand in the camps in the Orange Free State and 320 per thousand in the South African Republic camps. The worst month for deaths in Boer camps was October 1901, with 401 per thousand in the Orange Free State and 326 per thousand in the South African Republic. In the Orange Free State, the daily cost of feeding a Boer prisoner was 8,5 pence, and an African only 4,5 pence. Less than a third of the African prisoners received food free. The rest, who had been employed, had to pay for their meals. Africans had to buy so-called luxury items like tinned food, mealie meal, blankets, and clothing. In the case of Africans, causes of death of individuals were not recorded, although it is known that certainly among the Boers, pneumonia, measles, chickenpox, and dysentery predominated. The truth of the matter is that the camps were there for the purpose of breaking Boer resistance, and nobody cared what happened inside those camps to African or Boer. Officially, it was a white man's war. Neither the British nor the Boers would allow Africans to join them in the fight against the other side. Yet, it is believed that as many as 100,000 served as war scouts, spies, drivers, laborers, stretcher bearers, and servants. By the end of the war, nearly 10,000 Africans were under arms in the British forces. One man's name stands out amongst the thousands of Africans and coloureds who participated in the white man's war, Abraham Esau of Calvinia. When the British refused to arm the Africans and coloureds, he started an intelligence network to protect Calvinia against an attack from the Boers. When the attack came on the 10th of January 1901, the coloured people of Calvinia put up a spirited resistance, but they were savagely beaten. Esau was put in jail and finally cruelly executed. Gradually, the Boers' mobility was restricted by long lines of barbed wire fences that divided the country into massive camps. Blockhouses built of stone near strategic features such as railway bridges and of earth and corrugated iron in other places sprang up along the railway lines and barbed wire fences. By the end of the war, there were 8,000 of them. The war dragged on, and in England a powerful Stop the War movement began to grow. In South Africa too, there were those who no longer believed the war could be won by the republics, and a number of burger peace committees were formed. Peace negotiations had started at Middelburg in March 1901, but these had failed. By 1902, the Boers were divided into two groups, loosely called Britte raiders and hensoppers, and some Boers started to collaborate with the British. The South African Republic government and the government of the Orange Free State were granted permission to contact and confer with each other. They met on the 9th of April 1902 at Klerksdorp. They did agree on quite a few points, but they both insisted that they were not empowered to sign away their country's independence. Kitchener promptly arranged for a more representative gathering to be held and sent messengers under a flag of truce offering Boer commandos safe conduct to a meeting at Vereniging on the 15th of April 1902. "60 representatives were elected by the men still in the field, and a total of 72 representatives of the two republics assembled to formulate their proposals. The conditions for surrender were presented to Kitchener and Milner in Pretoria. The Boer delegates at the Pretoria conference were Boere, De La Rey, De Weet, Smuts, and Barry Hertzog. On the 29th of May 1902, they reported back to their colleagues at Vereniging. Some, like De Weet, were in favor of continuing the war, while Smuts made the point that to do so would be to sacrifice the Afrikaner nation itself upon the altar of independence. They met Milner in Pretoria on the 31st of May 1902 at Melrose House to sign the Treaty of Vereniging, which brought the war to an end.